Okay, thank you for this introduction. I will begin my presentation by expressing my warm thanks for the entire organization of this conference. I would have loved to be with you, but that wasn't possible. Anyway, I'm still glad to join you online. So the paper I'm presented, the paper I'm going to discuss today is entitled Zera Yaqob and Walda Heywat on gender equality, though sexual pleasure matter to equality. The philosophers I wish to discuss are still not very well known, even in the historiography of African philosophy. They are representative of the type of philosopher to whom the diversity reading list has tried to draw attention. And I also chose to address a subject which is not so much discussed among those who are interested in the talk of this philosopher, the question of gender equality. So basically, my talk will be divided in roughly two parts. One part where I show how they conceive the gender equality, and the other part where I will link this the conception of gender equality to the question of the sexual pleasure Okay, so I will start my talk by an historical overview to provide some element of the context in which Zera Yaqob and his disciple Walda Heywat lived and developed their idea. This preliminary will lead us to the examination of the anthropology, of the conception of human being, of the human nature, which is at the core and the foundation of the worth and dignity they recognize to every human being. It's also at the core, at the foundation of the status they recognize to women as rational beings. I will, by this, I will also discuss the influence of the sapiential heritage on the disciple of Zera Yaqob Walda Heywat, which may have led him, according to Claude Sumner, to depart from the ideas of his master. But this I will discuss this later. So I will end my showing that a fair access to sexual pleasure is to be related, as I already said, to the idea of equality between human beings. So let's start with the historical overview. Zera Yaqob and Walda Heywat are two Ethiopian philosophers who lived in the Horn of Africa in the 17th century. The country in which they lived was a Christian kingdom. It was a Christian kingdom in which several religions coexisted and with various degree of difficulties. Everything was not always peaceful. The first and the main religion was the Ethiopian Christianity, which is considered there as a local religion, not as a foreign religion, because I think that the Christianity established there on the 4th century of our era. Then we have Islam, which is the religion of a small community, which was welcomed by the king who converted to Islam, by the king who converted century with the arrival of the Jesuit missionaries, who were to be ultimately ousted nearly 1 century later. So Zera Yaqob and his disciple were thinkers who received what could be called a classical education in the Ethiopian context, as we can see through the stylistic element of their treatise. They were trained in the interpretation of the religious text in the Kene. That's a form of oral poetry found in the traditional education in the Ethiopian Orthodox Church. Their treatise also showed that they were also familiar with some of the doctrinal elements derived from Islam, Catholicism, and even Judaism. Uh, Despite this highly religious context, they think is profoundly rationalist, and we will see this a while later. They chose to distance themselves from many religious conceptions of their time is exemplified by the adoption of reason as the only necessary tool for understanding the world and for knowing God's will. Uh, Beyond their rationalism, which is the main interpretative framework for those who have been interested in the treatise. They also, I also I want to address this this topic, which is not so much discussed, as I said, the question of equality, which is a particular emphasis on the status of women and the sexual pleasure. But before coming to term with the discussion, I will start by uh, discussing what is the foundation of the conception of gender equality, that is the rationality of human being. Okay. So at the heart of the anthropology of Zera Yaqob and Walda Heywat, there are two main ideas: the idea of rationality and the idea of creation. Uh, for, for for the first one, the first idea, rationality. Rationality is essential for Zera Yaqob. Rationality is an essential quality distinguishing human being from other being and giving them superiority over over them. Reason must be conceived as the ability to think, as the ability to seek for truth, as the intelligence proper to human being, and at this faculty which is present in every human being and which allow them to acquire knowledge. Uh, the idea of rational nature is further developed, also is really further developed in the treatise of Walda Heywat. He makes a distinction. He makes a distinction between the fleshly nature and the spiritual nature of human being. That will remind us from something which is written in Descartes, for example. But maybe we will have to discuss about it later. Uh, Walda Heywat makes the distinction, I said, between the fleshly nature and the spiritual nature of a human being. He observed that a body a body devoid of a rational soul is nothing but dust, incapable of doing anything on its own. Since we are all capable of thinking and knowing, there must exist in every human being a rational soul performing this act. Therefore, not only there is a difference between the body and the soul in each person, but it is the spiritual essence that best defines the proper nature of human being. This spiritual nature is also the reason why human beings enjoy a special status. Human beings are obviously superior to plants, which cannot move, but this superiority applies particularly to animals which can have a conscious activity, but which are incapable of using human language. Uh, the, you, the argument of this argument of the use of human language may seem to be begging the question, I think. However, it is irrelevant to establish the worth of and the superiority of human being because it testifies it testify that they have an obvious ability to use their reason and to articulate their thought rationally, something which is not observed among any other being. The the second idea which can help us to understand the anthropology of this Ethiopian philosopher is that of divine creation. Uh, Both this conceive man as a creature made in the image of God. That is also reminiscent. Maybe we may probably discuss of it later. Of the idea found in since the medieval period in Europe of the imago Dei. They conceive man as as God creation. Reason itself is not a sui generis faculty. Like everything existing, it must have been created by a being which is the ultimate cause of anything that exists, namely God. A noticeable feature of their use of the cosmological argument is that it's not only intended to provide proof of the existence of God, the creator, it also explains why human beings are rational and why, as rational creatures, they can claim superiority over created beings, other created beings. Human beings are created in the image of God, God who himself is rational. For example, Zera Yaqob writes, uh, the creator who has endowed us with the faculties of reason and speech, cannot himself be devoid of these faculties. So we see that for Zera Yaqob as well as for Walda Heywat, we are rational because God bestow us with his own rationality, and that's what makes us superior to every human being. So let's turn now to the special status of women. Uh, unless one is prone to negate the humanity of women, and recognizing the dignity of human being necessarily implies recognizing the dignity of women as human being. However, and we will see this shortly later, distortion of reality and compromises with established principle and logic are not so much uncommon, particularly in the philosophical discourse. The history of philosophy is full of examples of philosophers who do not hesitate to curb their principle when it comes to applying them to a specific category of discriminated people, when it comes to protecting a group or a group privilege. In this context, it is interesting to see that Zera Yaqob was aware of the need to pay a particular attention to marginalized categories of people. Uh, his reflection take place in a context where Christian, Jewish, Muslim tradition has had a considerable influence on collective representation. Unfortunately, many of these representation tend to foster inequalities. For example, Zera Yaqob condemns the Muslim would think that it is right to sell and trade human beings as animal because they have a different religion. The impurity of menstruation for the impurity of menstruation is another fallacious accusation based on religious prescription, which nurtures discrimination and inequalities between human beings. If there is a purpose behind this particular allegation, it's undoubtedly to denigrate women and justify their inferiority as compared to men. Against this idea, Zara Yaqob argues that menstruation, which indicates the effective capacity to procreate, is part of the natural order established by God. Therefore, it must rather be considered as a sign of good health. He contrasts the teachings of these religion traditions with the divine law and the natural order of creation, which God Himself revealed to us through our reason. So for Zera Yaqob, it's not important to only obey what the religious tradition teach us. We must foremost be attentive to what our reason teach us as the real truth, as the truth revealed by God Himself. Behind this criticism, there's the idea that this tradition discriminate and hierarchize human being on questionable grounds. Discrimination based on gender, religion, and any other difference are problematic because they ignore the faculty of reason, which is at the heart of our human nature. While rationality grants a human being a superiority of creation, there is no reason to believe that there is some kind of hierarchy between the human being, since they all share this endowment with reason. This rational nature proper to every human being is rather a reason for Zera Yaqob to believe that all human beings are equal before God. That's what he writes. It would be inconsistent to claim that God created all human beings as intelligent and rational creatures, while also claiming that some have more or less value than others. It's also for this reason that Zera Yaqob condemns slavery and human trafficking as degrading because they equate, I quote, equate rational creation with irrational beast. Unfortunately, there is more ambiguity in the position of his disciple, as we will see in the next section. So uh, the question I'm asking here is, does Walda Heywat depart from the idea of his master on the status of women? As I already said that for Walda Heywat, all humans are created, are endowed with reason, and they are superior to every human being. However, Claude Sumner, the Canadian philosopher whose works and translation have introduced the Ethiopian philosophy to the English-speaking world, and I will say that to the non-Ethiopian world generally, has argued that the question of the status of women is is a significant point of disagreement between Zera Yaqob and Walda Heywat. He claimed that there is a significant difference, not only because there seems to be an explicit opposition on this issue, but also because the stylistic dissimilarities between the two philosophers support the hypothesis of a doctrinal divergence. Uh, to, to, to support his assumption, Sumner mentioned one of the quote of the treatise of Zera Yaqob that you have on the slide. I will read it. Zera Yaqob writes, "O man, remember that a woman is weak by nature and less intelligent than man. Therefore, bear patiently with the harshness of her nature and the loquacity of her tongue. Let her anger pass away, not giving it too great importance, and never quarrel with her. If you get used to this type of life, it will be easy for you. As to you, O woman, please your husband as much as you can. Give him delight by the food and drink and by taking care of his house and life. Your husband cannot love you unless you love him. If you love him, he cannot hate you." So we see clearly that there is a difference on the status or on the status of woman, and Sumner is pointing out this difference, and he's relating it to this passage. In Sumner interpret this passage as a sign of inferiority of the women compared to men, and as a sign of radical difference, of radical divergence between Zara Yaqob and Walda Heywat. This indeed is different from the teachings, of course, I told it of Zara Yaqob. Uh, uh, Sumner explained this difference between Zara Yaqob and Walda Heywat by the influence of the sapiential literature on the thought of Walda Heywat. This influence is perceptible on the way he writes, on the kind of story he narrates. Some refer here to the use of short story intended to transmit a moral lesson, and into the perception of women in spatial literature, uh, to the a perception of women in the sapiential literature, which is mostly negative. The in the in the in the in the story that are told in the sapiential literature, usually women are described as despicable, with a questionable moral character. Some may therefore conclude that sapiential saying of this type has left profound traces of in the treatise of Walda Heywat. In this unique case, traces are not only literary but also intellectual. Uh, Despite the argument that Sumner bring, I will say that maybe there are reasons to bring some nuance to what he to the conclusion he draws to this radical difference between Zera Yaqob and Walda Heywat. First of all, Zera Yaqob shares many of the doctrinal tenets of his master. He thinks that God created human being with reason, and this endowment with reason makes them all equal. That he thinks that the rationality grant them worth and superiority over any other creature, and that God has ordained what God has ordained is good in the way He did, and should not be condemned as impure or worthless. All this should have prepared him to follow his master in defending unconditionally the equality of any human being, regardless of the gender, including regardless of the gender. As a matter of fact, there are many passages in which he is effectively pleading for the equality. For example, he argues that equality apply to all human beings because of their nature, uh, and regardless of the fact that regardless of their gender or their religious affiliation. In his perspective, equality also entails reciprocal consideration and mutual respect. If we keep in mind that equality among human beings stems from God's will, and we give them rational, from God's will to give a human being a rational nature, it would be difficult to maintain consistently an hierarchy in nature between men and women without questioning the humanity of the latter. I don't think it's a step that Zera Yaqob will be prone to make. However, there is still, I think that there are reasons to have an alternative interpretation of the passage indicated by Sumner. The reference in the new translation by Wendy Bechler and the structure of the paragraph show that this passage is inspired by the Peter's epistle, in which he assigned duty proper to each member of the family. So there is a kind of a mirroring of this passage of the epistle where Peter said that you men, you are you are the head of the family. You should do this, this, and so things. So this might reveal that although Walda Heywat think that effective think that every human being are equal, there are still some prejudice in. He still have some prejudice about the character and the role of woman, but I don't think that it's really a matter of conviction. So the character, what they what ascribed to women, be executive, having a belligerent attitude, are still part of the prejudice many hold about women today. They cannot be excluded as part of the influence of the sapiential literature. Despite this, Walda Heywat and Zera Yaqob share this idea of equality among human beings, regardless of their religion and gender. And it is something that is particularly obvious when we look at the conception of marriage and the idea they have developed on sexual pleasure. So I decide in this section to ask whether sexual pleasure is a human right, because if we are we we are all equal and sexual pleasure is right, so it is okay. So we should have a unequal access to it. Uh, Sexual pleasure should be considered as a right due to human. For Zera Yaqob and Walda Heywat, sexual pleasure should be considered as a right due to every human being. Maybe before going further, it's necessary to begin with a clarification before we speak about marriage and sexual pleasure as a human right. The concept of human right is nowhere to be found in the treatise of Zera Yaqob and Walda Heywat. However, we find something similar and reminiscent of it. It is the idea that anything that conforms to the divine order and is part of the natural law cannot in any way be prohibited or restricted to certain people, either totally or partially. In this sense, rights are what are permitted to us because of the natural order and because of our rational nature. In other words, we have the right to do everything that our reason makes us perceive as good, and that is in accordance with our nature. No discrimination can be applied to such a right because it relies on the rational nature common to all human beings. It was on the basis of this consideration that this Ethiopian philosopher have rejected the monastic celibacy and the superiority of they have rejected the monastic celibacy as superior to marital life, or it's also on the basis of these considerations that they have rejected the assumption of the impurity of sexual intercourse. Marital life and sexual intercourse correspond to disposition of our nature that our reason show us to be good. Good. There is a passage in Walda Heywat treatise which is very instructive in this regard. He writes, after you are married as husband and wife, you should love one another with all your heart, because you are no longer two, but one flesh. From then on, neither of you should lust after another man or woman. As much as you can, give pleasure to one another with mutual care and perfect love. Beautify your whole life together and make your covenant of marriage delightful and rejoice in it. For this pleasure is allowed for both of you, and it is pure and pleasing to God who commanded marriage and sex. In, in his great wisdom, God created this drive in our flesh that makes the sweetness of sex blossom. So it is interesting to note that when speaking of the pleasure of marriage and of the sexual life, uh, Walda Heywat reminds the fact that it is and should be a shared pleasure. We must which must be granted to both lovers and not just to one. In another passage, he is more explicit, asking men to not to seek the pleasure of sex for themselves alone, but also to make it pleasant for their wives and ensure that the pleasure they take in the sexual act is in no way diminished. Although Claude Sumner has often emphasized that Walda Heywat holds a more practical approach to the theme he addresses. I don't think this is simply a common sense recommendation. The real issue here is the matter of the equality of spouses in marriage. Walda Heywat and Zera Yaqob have both stressed that there's no master or servant in the marriage because the spouses are equal. Since sexual pleasure is part of the natural order intended by God, there is no reason there's no reason why women should be deprived of it. In this sense, in the sense mentioned, sexual pleasure is actually a true human right. Uh, Another theme that can help us to see that marriage and sexual intercourse are conceived by this Ethiopian philosopher as structure for implementing equality is the theme of polygamy. In his treatise, Zera Yaqob argues that polygamy is contrary to God's will, who created men and women equal in number. Of course, this claim of proportional equality is not a statistical argument drawn from field research. It is. I think it's more likely a kind of observation of the fact that there's not a blatant disproportion between men and women. He seemed to interpret this observation as a manifestation of the creator's will for men and women to be equal, not only in proportion but also in rights. Uh, I will explain a bit later why it's not only about being equal in proportion but also in right. It's not simply stating that it is he's not simply saying that it is unnecessary for a man to marry more than one woman. It's also saying that polygamy is contrary to the order and law established by the creator. So why? That's the question. Uh, I think that there is something. If there's something peculiar among Zera Yaqob argument against polygamy, I think that there's something peculiar in his argument. Uh, Maybe we could rightly argue that there is a discrepancy in his reasoning between because the, from the equality in terms of proportion, there's a discrepancy between the equality in terms of proportion and the equality in terms of dignity and right. We cannot, from the equality of proportion, we cannot deduce an equality in dignity or rights. But if we were to discover, for example, that there were as many cabbages in the world as there were human beings, no one would dare to think that this implied the equality of dignity and right between human being and cabbages. However, I think that this argument against polygamy may seem less strange if we consider it to be a rebuttal to those who promote polygamy by arguing that there are more men than women, an argument which is still used by some people today, unfortunately. The implicit assumption in the argument for polygamy is that by marrying many women, men are doing them a favor by bringing them out of celibacy. Uh, this seemingly benevolent argument remains on highly problematic. This seemingly benevolent argument remain on highly problematic assumption because the price to be paid for this supposed favor is unfair. For example, God created men and for Zera Yaqob, God created men and women equal in nature and disposition. They are created with the same fleshy desires so that they may be satisfied each other through sexual desire. They may both be satisfied equally in the framework of the marriage. This presupposes mutual satisfaction, which is not the case when in the situation of polygamic marriage, the husband is has an asymmetric relationship to his spouses. In this relation in the polygamous relationship, the husband is more likely to have his desire satisfied than his women, and this asymmetry of polygamy grants undue privilege to men, and it leads to an unfair discrimination against women. So, advocating, that's the point of what I've been saying here, for Zera Yaqob as well as for Walda Heywat, advocating for the unequal access to sexual pleasure, advocating against polygamy is a way to defend concretely the equality of and the right of all human beings, whether men or women. So I will stop here and say thank you for your kind attention.